First joined my gang when I was approximately 13. So in my neighborhood, we all knew each other. So you come through elementary school together, you come through middle school, not necessarily high school. So I was already kind of affiliated with my gang coming out of the 6th grade, and I joined when I was about 7th grade.
You know, the youngest of gang members, it's almost an evolution where you start out by doing simple things in the gang, like tagging, being a lookout, dealing drugs, and then it generally progresses to, you know, we see it to stealing cars, breaking into houses, carrying guns, and then you graduate to the real hardcore guys who are obviously doing robberies and murders and shootings and things like that.
The media portrayal of street gangs tends to be one of either demonization or sort of glorification, sensationalistic. They focus on street gangs when there's some kind of problem. There's a drive-by shooting, or they're extorting money or robbery. The crimes or the violence is what they focus on. And indeed, a lot of street gangs and street gang members are involved in serious crime and violence. But that's only one part of a much, much bigger picture of what happens in street gangs and the functions that street gangs serve.
People become extraordinarily fearful of the unknown. And if the unknown then gets packaged with a set of tropes and conventions that have been used to describe minority youth, gee whiz, perfect storm, all hell's breaking loose on the streets. The number one job is to protect. And so let's round them up, let's put them in jail, let's give them the harshest penalties we can.
They shot at the window, so they lit up all this area right here. Yeah.
How old were you?
I was like, I think I was 3 already. I think at that time, I was 3 already. 3 years old. Because I remember my mom was still painting with my brother, so I was 3.
So tell me, like, what were the worst years for violence around here?
The worst year for violence? Like in the early 90s, mid 90s.
Yeah.
That's when the whole war was going on with 2 different neighborhoods inside the projects. There was like cars being blown up, people shooting at each other from the windows.
When I started, I came on the job in the summer of '96, and you know, it was kind of like the movies. You drive down the street and there's, you know, 3, 4, 5 gang members hanging out in particular neighborhoods. You know, they'd walk around really without any fear of anybody.
In 1988, the homicide rate in the city of Los Angeles began to climb steadily until it reached an all-time high of 1,092 murders in 1992. The following year saw only a slight decrease, with 1,077 homicides taking place. Police estimate that between 50 and 60% of all murders in the city are gang-related. Over the next several years, the murder rate in Los Angeles declined steadily, mirroring a nationwide trend. Yet it was during this period that politicians and the news media began to sound the alarm that a far worse wave of deadly crime was on its way, and that those perpetrating it would be the nation's youth. One of the loudest and most influential voices was that of John DiIulio, a criminologist at Princeton University. In an article that appeared in the Weekly Standard on November 27, 1995, DiIulio coined the term that would, in the years to follow, become the main buzzword for the societal panic over juvenile crime: super predators. On the horizon, he wrote, are tens of thousands of severely morally impoverished juvenile super predators. They are perfectly capable of committing the most heinous acts of physical violence for the most trivial reasons. In prison or out, the things that super predators get by their criminal behavior, sex, drugs, money, are their own immediate rewards. Nothing else matters to them. So for as long as their youthful energies hold out, they will do what comes naturally: murder, rape, rob, assault, burglarize, deal deadly drugs, and get high. The media took up the story, and soon politicians on both ends of the political spectrum were pledging their support for harsher penalties for juvenile offenders.
We should pass the Victims' Rights Amendment to the Constitution, and I ask you to mount a full-scale assault on juvenile crime with legislation that declares war on gangs with new prosecutors and tougher penalties.
Juvenile arrests may double by the year 2010. Unless something is done soon, some of today's newborns will become tomorrow's super predators, merciless criminals capable of committing the most vicious of acts for the most trivial reasons, a pair of sneakers or a football jersey.
This whole concept came from a book by a guy named John DeLulio, who was at Princeton at the time, and in part J.Q. Wilson, where they were arguing that what had happened in the 90s was that gangs and crack cocaine had created these youth super predators, these young people, teenagers, who were lurking around every corner, waiting to rob you, steal from you, violently assault you, and that we ought to be fearful of them, and that because they were the children of the baby boom, there was going to be a surge or a bulge in the number of them. But the end game for the conservatives was that there was an epidemic, it was a dangerous one, it was primarily kids of color, and something needed to be done to stop them. And so state after state started passing laws that had harsher and harsher elements in terms of the treatments of juveniles.
In California, former Governor Pete Wilson drafted Proposition 21, also known as the Gang Violence and Juvenile Crime Prevention Act. It was to serve as an amendment to an earlier piece of legislation enacted by the California legislature in 1988, the Street Terrorism Enforcement and Prevention Act, often referred to as the STEP Act. Under the STEP Act, participation in a street gang became a punishable offense, and anyone convicted of a felony that was committed for the benefit of a street gang was to receive additional years added on to his or her sentence. Under the STEP Act's terms, the length of these sentencing enhancements could extend up to 3 years beyond the sentence awarded for the underlying felony. With Wilson's proposed amendment, however, someone who committed a crime for the benefit of a street gang could have up to 10 years added on to his or her sentence. In addition, the measure included stipulations that would make it easier to try juveniles as adults, and also increase the number of crimes that would be subject to the terms of the Three Strikes Law. On March 7th of 2000, Proposition 21 went before California voters, where it passed, earning 62% of the popular vote. In a 2011 article published in the Journal of the Institute of Justice and International Studies, authors Beth Caldwell and Ellen C. Caldwell assert that the measure was able to win a majority of the vote, despite the fact that its backers did not invest in an advertising campaign.
In contrast to other initiative campaigns where, Pete Wilson himself invested funding in getting the word out through commercials, for Proposition 21 there was virtually no advertising. And I think the reason for that is that it wasn't even necessary. The media had already sort of imprinted these images that made people sort of associate juveniles with crime and created this sort of almost hysteria that juvenile crime was on the rise. These kids were getting more and more violent. There was this widespread fear that I think had permeated society so much that there wasn't even a need for advertising. People would just read, the Juvenile Crime Initiative, or I forget exactly what it was called, the Gang Violence and Juvenile Crime Initiative, and just seeing those trigger words, gang and juvenile, was enough to make people say, oh yes, we need to get tougher on crime.
The news accounts, both of juvenile crime and adult crime, were dominated, and still to this day dominated, by the old concept, if it bleeds, it leads. So showing crime scenes, police tape, investigators, bodies in the street, gang perpetrators as suspects, is eye-catching And if the goal of television news, of television more generally, is to get eyeballs to the screen, then this is unfortunately the way it's done in this country. So the relationship to legislation and initiatives like Proposition 21 at the time were in direct response to the fear being generated by these if it bleeds, it leads news stories about teenage predators in particular.
When journalists are doing stories about street gangs, they tend to rely on law enforcement or former gang members for information about the gang, which can often be distorted. Former gang members might exaggerate the role that they played in the gang or how notorious their particular gang is.
Thomas Ward is a professor of anthropology at the University of Southern California. As part of a research project, he spent 8 years hanging out with members of the MS-13 street gang in Los Angeles, and another 8 years conducting follow-up interviews with some of the members. In his view, the news accounts of gang life are often far removed from the reality.
And so the real picture of street gangs rarely enters the news or media in film and television. Because the reality is that most of what street gang members do is hang out on street corners and shoot the breeze instead of shooting somebody else. And it's incredibly boring. And so news does not cover really boring, normalized activities. And so they focus on the worst of gang crimes and violence.
If widespread fear caused by sensationalized media coverage of crime was one major factor in the passage of Proposition 21, then running parallel to this was the fact that the measure was decided by popular vote. Currently, California is one of 19 states that allow citizens to propose changes to either state statutes or the state constitution using a system known as the direct initiative process. Under this system, anyone wishing to create a change to the law has only to collect a certain number of signatures in support of their proposition. Once this has been achieved, the measure will be put on the ballot to be decided by popular vote.
It seemed to me like the initiative process was sort of a way that people with people's misperceptions and fears could really have tangible political results. So like Proposition 21, for example, had lots and lots of changes to the law. I mean, it's pages and pages long of changes that even practicing attorneys who don't specialize in juvenile justice would probably have a difficult time understanding because there were so many changes to the law. And the average voter doesn't read the text of the law, maybe doesn't even read the sort of legislative analyst summary, is just looking at this one-liner, let's get tougher on juveniles and gang members. And, so that's something that, based on people's sort of sometimes misperceptions, that's something that people wanted to support, I think, without even really understanding what the changes to the law would actually be.
Thanks to Proposition 21, many of the protections afforded to juvenile offenders in California have disappeared, and lengthy prison terms for juveniles and gang members have become not only easier for judges to award, but, in some cases, mandatory.
Yeah, it's hard to really identify the effects of Proposition 21 because there were actually so many changes that it brought about. It lumped together two completely different areas of criminal law. So it made a bunch of changes to juvenile delinquency law, and then it also made a lot of changes to gang sentencing laws that would apply to juveniles and adults.
The question remains, however, has Proposition 21 succeeded in making communities safer? According to LAPD officer Brandon Purice, the answer is a definite yes.
Over my career, the crime rate, not only the homicide rate, but the crime rate has dropped to levels that we haven't seen since the 50s and 60s. Now, is it due to stiffer sentences? I don't think it's necessarily specifically because of that, but I think that's one factor in creating a safer society. It wasn't uncommon for me in my first couple of years to run into gang members who had done 7-8 years for a murder and are now on parole, and it was almost a revolving justice system in terms of violent crime. Now, with stiffer sentences on violent crime, including juvenile offenders, people are spending longer and longer behind bars, and you're keeping that core group of very, very hardened criminals away for longer periods of time, and it keeps the streets safer.
Others, however, see the situation differently.
I don't think that stiffer sentences or gang enhancements or adding more possibilities for life sentences, I don't think that any of those approaches have been proven to decrease crime. And actually, in some cases, I think they can actually increase crime. Recidivism is really high from prison, and it makes sense that if you take a 16 or 17-year-old and lock them up for years in an environment that's very violent, where they are likely to be victimized, that when they're released, they have not been rehabilitated, and often they've been further traumatized and maybe likely to continue to engage in crime. So I think that a better approach would be to look at why people are actually getting involved in crimes and craft solutions that respond to those sort of root causes.
Even Officer Parise agrees that prisons can often do more harm than good in terms of the effects that they have on the individuals locked inside.
I'd say that going to prison doesn't necessarily make that person any better or keep them from committing crime. In fact, it's generally the opposite. I mean, you generally learn how to be a better criminal, but they're also kept away from society for longer and longer periods of time. And I think even if you keep them away from society for longer and longer periods of time, they'll get out at a later and later age, 40, 50, 60, and by then their desire to commit crime is much, much lower. And you don't see, most guys in their 50s and 60s even wanting to be involved in the day-to-day operations or any type of criminal activity by then. And if you can keep the people off the streets till then, you're probably saving lives along the way.
I see where that argument is coming from, but I feel like it's more detrimental than anything, because I feel like it ruins like a network of lives. So it's like
Luz Flores is a member of the Youth Justice Coalition, a Los Angeles-based organization working to dismantle race, gender, and class inequality in California's juvenile justice system. As she sees it, the idea of locking people up to keep the community safer is not as simple as it appears.
So it's like, it's not just like, oh yeah, we're just locking this one person away. Like, no, like their whole family has to suffer. There's like people without dads now. There's like babies without dads. There's mothers that have to struggle because that father figure is not there. So they're like forced to raise this child, and the child doesn't have their father there. So they like continue on the lifestyle, or they continue down the wrong choices and the wrong paths.
Regardless of the effect that prison time can have on individuals, it seems that locking people up has been the method of choice in terms of the way that officials in California deal with the issue of gang crime. Not only have sentences increased in length, thanks in part to Proposition 21, but for the past 20 years, another tool has been employed by law enforcement that has made it much easier to put gang members behind bars, sometimes for actions that would be completely legal for anyone who is not considered to be a member of a gang. A tool known as a civil gang injunction.
I got stuck with a gang injunction about 4 years ago, and it sucked. It changed my life. Like, I knew that I didn't fully understand what it was. I had an idea of what it was, but I didn't really fully understand it the way I understand it now. So, but when I got started with it, I knew that I couldn't talk to certain people anymore. I knew I couldn't be outside past 10 o'clock. I knew that I couldn't wear certain colors. I think that's about what I knew from it at that time. But then I started, learning more about it, and I knew that I couldn't even do certain hand signs. I couldn't be within 15 feet of an open alcohol container in public. Or else I could go to jail. I could get arrested and go to jail.
Gang injunctions are basically used in areas where a gang has a stranglehold on a particular neighborhood, and it's, a lot of these gangs have spent generations and generations in a particular neighborhood. The gang injunctions are used to keep gang members from associating in any particular neighborhood. The city basically sues the gang, and the court provides a court order saying you can't do one of several activities. And if you are caught violating that court order, then you can be arrested for that.
Sometimes described as restraining orders against street gangs, civil gang injunctions serve to restrict the actions of gang members within a certain defined area, known as the safety zone. And while such measures have existed since the 1980s, it was not until 1993 that injunctions in their current form came into being. That year, prosecutors filed a lawsuit against the Blythe Street gang in Van Nuys, arguing that the gang constituted a public nuisance. They asked the judge to grant a type of restraining order against the gang known as a civil gang injunction. Such restraining orders had been filed against street gangs previously, but this time there was a significant difference. In the past, only actions that were already considered to be against the law were listed under the injunction's terms, actions such as destruction of property and public urination. If an individual was caught committing one of the offenses named on the injunction, police could arrest that person and charge him or her with the more serious crime of violating the terms of the injunction. However, in the case against the Blythe Street gang, the judge ruled that police had the right to include otherwise legal actions on the injunction as well. Thanks to this ruling, for all those served with an injunction today, charges as simple as possessing a cell phone or waving at cars can earn them a 6-month term in jail. However, the actions most commonly prohibited by injunctions are the following: association with other gang members in public, intimidation of victims or witnesses to gang activity, possessing guns or other dangerous weapons, creating graffiti or possessing graffiti tools, being in the presence of illegal drugs, being in the presence of alcohol, and trespassing. In the eyes of many officials, including Officer Brandon Purice, the injunctions are seen as a necessary tool in the fight to make neighborhoods safer for the people who live there.
When I started, I came on the job in the summer of '96, and it was kind of like the movies. You drive down the street and there's 3, 4, 5 gang members hanging out in particular neighborhoods. They'd walk around really without any fear of anybody. They'd see the police obviously, and they turn around and go different directions. But once the gang injunctions started to come around and really be enforced by the gang units, guys weren't hanging out. Guys weren't openly asserting what they consider authority over their turf. And things started to slowly change from, hey, this is a bad neighborhood, there's tagging, graffiti everywhere, to now kids are starting to come out into the streets again and play at night, and families are more willing to come out with their kids, and it's a little bit safer, and it's grown over time to where the gangs don't control the neighborhoods necessarily anymore, but the families are starting to reconnect with their communities.
In July of 2009, the City Attorney's Office of Los Angeles published a document entitled Gang Injunctions, How and Why They Work. The report put forth an overwhelmingly positive view of injunctions, with the authors stating the following. In the final analysis, the Los Angeles City Attorney's use and enforcement of gang injunctions is entirely consistent with due process of law, follows well-established legal precedent, protects the neighborhoods of Los Angeles, and safeguards the civil liberties of all the city's residents. Yet despite the praise from law enforcement officials, there is another side to these measures that can be much more damaging than they let on. A side that Beth Caldwell witnessed while working for a nonprofit organization in Venice, California.
So I worked as the youth development director at Venice Community Housing Corporation, which is in the Oakwood community of Venice. There were 2 gang injunctions in the community at the time that I worked there, which was from around 2002 to 2006. One was targeted primarily at the main Latino gang in the area, and the other at the major African American gang in the community. And at the time I was running a job training program for young people who wanted to change their lives around. But we had a lot of people who were on the gang injunctions, and it was really demoralizing to a lot of them, because the local police would often wait right outside of our offices. And like if 2 of them were walking to get lunch together on their lunch break, they would stop them and they could cite them because the gang injunction prohibits like being seen in public with somebody else who is subject to the injunction.
It just, from the moment you wake up to the moment you go to sleep, you gotta watch who you talk to. And I live in projects, so like everything is close together, everything I mean, it's like it's a small area, you know. So everybody knows each other. Everybody grew up with each other. I have friends that I went to pre-K with, you know. So elementary school, middle school, and my neighbors, I couldn't talk to certain neighbors. I think I could have gotten arrested if me and my neighbor if he stood on his porch and I stood on my porch, we could get arrested for that because that's within 200 feet. And you can't be within 200 feet of anybody who's an alleged gang member.
So there's no requirement that they're doing anything criminal, right? And that's really the problem is, you know, the sense that these young people got was like, I'm trying to change my life around and, you know, they're never going to let me.
Today, there are more than 40 gang injunctions in Los Angeles alone, and joining the activities of nearly 80 different street gangs.
I think what's caused gang injunctions to be problematic may have been serving people the individual may not have necessarily felt they deserved to have been served with a gang injunction. Maybe they weren't, in their opinion, the most active gang member. They weren't out there committing as many crimes as maybe some of these others. I think that the number of people that were added may have been too many. But if you stick to the hardcore group, it's really, really effective in these neighborhoods.
But in practice, gang injunctions often don't stick to the hardcore members. And amongst those listed as defendants on injunctions, there have often been family members who are then no longer allowed to see each other in public. It's an issue that is encountered often at Homeboy Industries, a gang intervention center located in downtown Los Angeles. One of the employees there is Jose Asuna, who serves as the Director of Employment Services for Homeboy. But as a former gang member himself, the issues surrounding gang injunctions have long been personal ones for him.
So, you know, my son got put on a gang injunction simply because he was driving in a car with me. So I was already on a gang injunction, so they had already identified me as an active gang member. And because he was in the vehicle with me, it didn't matter whether he was my son or not. Law enforcement that day chose to just say, we're going to put you on a gang injunction, and if you fight it, then we're going to take you to juvenile hall.
And though Asuna says that his son had never actually been involved in street gangs, that didn't stop him from being subject to the terms of the gang injunction once it had been served.
So that meant that I couldn't drive around with my own son without being at risk of both of us being incarcerated. So I know that that affects other families as well, where brothers and sisters and fathers and daughters and fathers and sons and mothers and daughters are put on gang injunctions. And so they're not really able to be in certain areas together because they run the risk of being arrested. Also, job-wise, you know, I'm Director of Employment Services at Homeboy Industries, so I've actually run into some cases where I can't place people in certain jobs because there's already somebody there working that's on the same gang injunction. So if that person goes to work there, they're both at risk of being violated on the gang injunction.
While the restrictions on association between gang members is often the most talked about aspect of injunctions, many other actions also become illegal for those who have been served.
I've represented a client in juvenile court who was subject to a gang injunction in Hawaiian Gardens. That injunction prohibited people from riding bikes, and he was riding his bike to the store a few blocks down the street. His mother had asked him to go pick up some groceries, and he got arrested because he was riding his bike. And it was, you know, the way the injunction is written, it's hard to create a defense because he was riding his bike. The issue is whether he should have been subject to the injunction. But you know, that's also difficult because it's fairly easy to prove gang membership.
And once a person has been convicted of violating an injunction, the punishment can be up to $1,000 in fines and a 6-month term in jail.
So we're talking about half a year of being removed from the community, being removed from your family, and that has a deep impact. You know, that can have some serious repercussions in someone's life. So I don't think that the punishment that they choose to dish out is very fair. And I don't think that they they understand the impact that it can have in someone's life when they remove somebody from the community and their family for that amount of time.
Despite the problems many people see in them, most gang injunctions are put in place without receiving much attention from the public. But in 2013, one proposed injunction began to make headlines in the Los Angeles area. In June, the LA City Attorney's Office had requested an injunction that would create a so-called safety zone in the Glendale corridor area of the city, which includes the Echo Park neighborhood as well as portions of neighboring Silver Lake. If passed, the injunction would be served to members of 6 street gangs in the area: the Big Top Locos, the Crazies, the Diamond Street Locos, the Echo Park Locos, Frogtown, and the Headhunters. Almost immediately, opposition began to grow in response to the proposal, much of it centered around the fact that the area was not one of the most crime-ridden in the city, and in fact, some statistics indicated it was experiencing its lowest crime rate in decades. So why the proposal for such a measure now? It seemed to some that the city attorney's decision to pursue an injunction there had less to do with legitimate concerns over gang crime and more to do with the desire to facilitate gentrification in the area. Over the preceding decade, Echo Park had experienced a gradual influx of middle-class white residents and simultaneously a decrease in the number of working-class Latino residents. And as those who would be subject to the injunction invariably belonged to the second group, critics worried that the measure would simply aid in the destabilization and displacement of a portion of the population that was considered less desirable by city officials. The arguments of protesters convinced the Echo Park Neighborhood Council to vote against supporting passage of the injunction, while a similar vote by the Silver Lake Neighborhood Council ended in a tie. Ultimately, however, the decision rested with Superior Court Judge Abraham Khan, and on September 26 of 2013, he decided to approve passage of the Echo Park gang injunction.
I was up in Echo Park recently, and that's like one of the areas that recently got served on a gang injunction, and we were really trying to fight so they wouldn't get served for a gang injunction. And I was on the bus, and I saw like a group of like white males congregating, you know. And I just like in my head, it's like if those were like black or brown males congregating like in their park, like in their driveway, like the cops would have pulled up like right away and like harass them or ask them what they were doing, you know. But since they're like a group of white young men, you know, they don't get like the same treatment. They don't get targeted the same manner as like the other populations.
The city claims that it's to save lives, for like public safety, but most of the time the injunctions are placed in cities and communities that are not experiencing the highest levels of violence. Like in Echo Park, they had the lowest crime rates in 30 years. And they just got a gang injunction. And we're starting to see that in a lot of different cases where communities are getting gang injunctions that the real estate around the zone is going up. It's like selling high, so it's all tied in with like gentrification and all that stuff.
Such accusations raise troubling questions about what types of residents city officials care most about keeping safe. But when asked what his opinion of gang injunctions would be, if they really were restricted to areas that experience the highest levels of gang crime, Cazares had this to say.
Well, I don't think gang injunctions are the right solution to like, you know, gang violence or whatever. I feel like that's just putting like a Band-Aid on a bullet wound, you know. And what happens with that is only gonna keep leaking. It's gonna get infected. You know, like you got to go in and take out the bullet out the wound to really heal it. You know, so I think you have to ask yourself, like, why is there young people out in the streets that are selling drugs and you know, like robbing people? You know, like it's because there's nothing out there for those young people.
To some degree, City Attorney Mike Fuhr seemed to concur when he made the following statement in a press release following the passage of the Echo Park gang injunction. We've got to be tough on violent gang activity, and gang injunctions such as this one in the Glendale corridor are an important step, but we should complement this approach with an array of strategies to deter and prevent gang activity in the first place. That's why my office is working with families, schools, elected officials, city departments, and the community as a whole on measures including safe passages for kids to schools, prevention and intervention programs, improve city services such as street lighting, and nuisance abatement of properties tied to crime. Even Jose Asuna sees potential for gang injunctions to be used effectively, even though the problems thus far have tended to outweigh the benefits.
I believe in gang injunctions. That might surprise some people, but I'm a father and I have children, and I live in a very violent part of Long Beach. So if there's a tool that can be used to keep my children safer, to keep active gang members from hanging around on street corners when they have no business hanging around on street corners, then as a father and as a member of the community, then I want law enforcement to have whatever tools they can at their disposal. But I definitely want them used in a fair way, in a different way than they're being utilized many times currently.
With 45,000 street gang members in Los Angeles alone, according to the LAPD, and countless more throughout the state, the problem is simply too big and too complex for officials in California to try to solve by plucking the supposed bad apples out of each community and sending them to jail for longer and longer periods of time and for smaller and smaller offenses, such as being in public near an open alcohol container or possessing tools that could be used to write on walls.
The majority of my homeboys, by the time they were 13, had already been to YA. They've already been to LP, Los Padrinos, Silmar. So, they're already acclimated to the juvenile justice system. They already knew, I'm going to go in and do this amount of time, I do this.
Many years ago, Alicia Cass was a gang member living on the streets of Los Angeles. And during that time, many of the young people with whom she associated were caught up in a continuous cycle of crime and imprisonment.
So, they already knew. So a lot of them, like I said, by the time they were in middle school, had already done jail time. And by the time they were adults, and most definitely had already done a lot of prison time. And they just knew it was part of the game. You go in there, you pull your couple of years, you come out. So, it was kind of accepted. This is what we do. This is how we live. And then prison is a whole other system in itself regarding gangs. And then they come out, they come home, and then the cycle starts all over again.
Today, Cass works as a social worker in Los Angeles County, and the issues she confronts with her clients on a daily basis often mirror those that she herself faced during her own childhood, issues which pushed her into joining a gang at the age of 13.
So I came from an abusive house, sexual molestation, physical abuse. My mother died when we were little. So I found that a lot of my peers or a lot of other gang members, when we bonded, we had the same issues. And the gang was like family. So you figure you're living in an abusive household, an abusive parent, and then you have these same people that's on the outside that's welcoming you in, and you're a part of their family. My logic was, why stay home and be abused? I can go on the street and be abused.
I didn't join a gang because I wanted to commit a crime. I joined a gang because I was seeking family, structure, attention, love. And gang members rarely are running toward the gang. They're really running away from something. And when you're in a low-income community, when you're in a community that is full of gangs and violence, then you have very little choices of what you're running to. For most of us, only the gang is there.
How can you say they're just gang members? No, we just didn't come into this community where we were already gang members, there's somewhere that within our community where it went wrong, something is not, the community isn't serving the youth what they need. So the youth feel they feel trapped. They feel what are my alternatives? What else is there out there for me?
So until they go back and they fix the heart of the matter, and they look at these gang members as people, things that happened to them as children, something happened to make them involved. They just didn't wake up killers. They didn't wake up thieves. We didn't wake up decide we just want to sell dope because we're bored. We're hungry. We have to, we have to survive out there in the streets. And so until they do that, they're always going to have a generation of gang members. So until they fix the heart of the community and go back and look at the heart of the kids and help families, they'll always have gang members. So they'll just keep locking up generation after generation, and they'll keep springing up and springing up.